Hello, buddy. It's Wyvern here with a Total War Warhammer 2 tier list that has been requested for quite a while now, and that is the Skaven faction tier list. Now, Skaven are a faction that's gone through quite a lot of ups and downs over the course of Total War's life cycle. When the game was first released, they were kind of busted because they had a handful of mechanics that were just literally broken. Most importantly, the Gutter-Runner Shurikens actually bypassed shield block, which made them incredibly difficult and borderline impossible to deal with, and at least for some factions. And on top of that, the Skaven summons actually sort of warped through models and could get like a perfect surround and just have all the models hitting a target at once, which is just insane. So there were some bugs early on in life cycle that made Skaven busted. However, once that was fixed, Skaven kind of slipped to being a bottom tier faction and stayed that way right up until their DLC dropped with the Prophet and the Warlock. And that DLC essentially completely flipped the faction on its head. It went from being a basically bottom of the barrel faction to being literally S tier, arguably the strongest faction in the game at that point. Now, a few further patches later, a whole nother DLC later. In fact, we also got Shadow and the Blade. That made Skaven one of the first factions besides Regiment to get 2 faction DLCs. I should say Regiment and Empire, I guess. But and I guess Dark Elves. So I guess they're not the, but still the Skaven were one of the first factions to get 2 faction DLCs. But despite all of that, Skaven have remained have sort of stabilized as being a very powerful faction, but nowhere near as OP now. Certain factions certain units such as Doomflayers were toned down a bit, as were Warlock Jezzails, which were really disgusting on release. Certain abilities and lords were also toned down a bit. Lord Skrulk used to be an absolute monstrosity that was near impossible to deal with. Now he's definitely been toned down to a more respectable level. Same thing, though, to a lesser extent with AK Claw. AK Claw didn't drop in at quite as broken of a state, in my opinion, but also was very powerful and it's kind of been toned down. But Skaven are definitely in a solid position right now, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how exactly everything tiers up. One of the important things to keep in mind with Skaven is that while there are certainly some units that are not great and you're probably not going to use very often, the majority of the faction is viable, and except a lot of it's viable in very different builds. So Skaven have rush builds, they've got very campy builds, they've got sort of hybrid builds, and different units can work in different builds. And because of that, I think Skaven massive versatility actually means none of their units are really, or maybe very few, I don't even think any of their units really are quite that insane in how mandatory they are. It's not... Skaven, in a sense, just have a lot of viable units, but none of them are sort of must-have lock-ins. And so it's going to be interesting, I think, going through this list and seeing just where everything falls through. Now, to kick things off, we are going to start with Lord Skrulk. The Skaven don't actually get a head honcho, really. It's just kind of various clan representatives. So we're going to kick off with Lord Skrulk, who is an easy, and I mean easy, S tier. Even after his nerfs to both the Rod of Corruption as well as Lee Rubonicus, damage reductions, nerfs to probability of Lee Rubonicus actually doing damage, the ever stricter limitations on how many uses you could get out of abilities, especially Lee Rubonicus, have sort of toned these back. Yet Skrulk remains an absolutely fearsome sort of presence on the battlefield. His 2 abilities are still insanely powerful. He still does get an aura of Pestilence that does debuff enemy melee attack by 5, which is pretty solid. He himself is no pushover in melee, and he provides the Contaminated effect. So you can combine him with other fear, terror-causing units or other leadership debuffs to break enemy morale and make them rout very, very easily. He himself doesn't have terrible combat stats, so he can kind of fight his way out of bad situations. Not ideally, because he doesn't have armor, but still, he's no pushover. He's definitely a very respectable combat caster hybrid. And of course, Lore of Plague, which is an insanely powerful lore. Granted, Skrulk is not one of the best caster lords, but he still does get access to Lore of Plague, which is a lot of cheap and efficient spells. He can get lots of rat summons. He can, of course, apply Wither to debuff enemy armor. Basically, no matter what build you run with him, you can get some value out of some of his magic. The passive for the lore is also solid, not as OP as it once was, where you'd like 5 or 6 casts of any spell would reduce enemy vigor to like crippling, tired, or very tired. But still, the passive is still pretty strong on the lore. Skulk is just a rather respectable lord in all ways. He's even pretty cost effective. Really, his only major downside, in my opinion, is that he's a foot lord, which obviously comes with the fact that he's not able to really pick his engagements all that well, and the fact that he is pretty squishy. Despite the fact that he has pretty good armor HP, the fact that he just does not have armor is a big killer. If you get up against an opponent, for example, against Wood Elves, if they bring like a Waystalker or something, you are in for a bad day. You're going to get sniped hard. Now, next up, we are going to go with the other OG Lord. We're just going to go by chronological order here, but the other OG Lord, and that is Queek. And he's not going S tier, that's for sure. For me, Queek is somewhere between D and C tier. I think I'm going to be nice here and put him in C. I'm not 100% sold that's where he belongs, but I don't think he's a very good Lord choice at all in the majority of matchups. Now, he has undergone several changes. He has improved significantly since his inception, plus Footlords in general have improved since Warhammer 2 dropped. Unfortunately, I still think Queek's only solid matchup is Dwarves, and even there it's a bit iffy because he is a pretty easy target to snipe for cannons and gyrocopters and units like that. The fact of the matter is that Footlords are just too easy for artillery to smack around. And so, really, what should be Queek's best matchup there, it still isn't very strong. Now, Warp Shard Armor is very powerful, in fact. It does debuff enemy armor as well as melee defense, which is pretty nuts. He synergizes, in the Dwarf matchup especially, he synergizes insanely well with the plethora of other armor debuffs Skaven can get. You combine him with Weeping Blade from Death Runners. You combine him with Wither from Lord of Plague. You can bring a Plague Caster, something along those lines. You combine him with the Armor Sundering from the Regiment of Renowned Doomflayers. And you essentially combo him with various other Armor Sundering effects. And you can make units like, especially Stormvermin, perform incredibly well against well-armored or normally well-armored enemy troops. And that is really, in my opinion, the big selling point for Queek, or is really his big power spike. But unfortunately, in general, I just don't think he's that good. I still think you're generally better off bringing just about any other Skaven Lord, with a few exceptions, which we will get into in just a little bit. Now, going on to the next Lord that was released, we do have Tretch Craventail, and Tretch has, in my opinion, actually slipped down in tier since release. He was not a very good Lord to begin with, but I think he's actually gotten worse relative to everybody else. And the reason for that is simple. Now, when Tretch released, he was the only Vanguard-capable Skaven Lord. And he had a niche as a sort of tanky combatant. He had anti-large, which wasn't the greatest thing ever because it wasn't AP, and he's a foot lord. But decent armor, lucky skull helm, dirt cheap, Vanguard. He was a very cheap and tanky choice. He also did have Tretch's Raiders, so if you were winning in combat, you could potentially buff some units to do a little more damage. So he wasn't a terrible combat support lord. Still not a king tier, or still not a top tier lord, but definitely could have been comparable to, say, Quake. You would probably have been like C tier. Right now, I think with the implementation of other characters, most notably, I think Ikit, who's actually a very tanky caster combat hybrid, but also to a lesser extent Snitch, who's just a much better Vanguard option, as well as the Master Assassin character. I think that, unfortunately for him, poor Tretch has just really fallen off. He's just nowhere near that usability. His two big niches, Vanguard deployment and cheap tankiness, have kind of been supplanted. I get that Ikit isn't cheap, but he doubles as a caster, and he can get like a Doom Realm mount and stuff. So it's much better than what Tretch brings. That doesn't mean he's completely unusable. He still does have that AoE buff. He is still dirt cheap relative to most things. He is still fairly tanky for how cheap he is, but I don't think there are many matchups or many builds where you would intentionally want to bring Tretch and he'd bring you serious benefit over alternatives. Now, next up, of course, we do have Ikit Claw. This is a second easy S tier. Hybrid combat caster. You can bring it with the benefit of mounts, unlike Skrulk. You can put this guy on a Doom Flare, you can put him on a Doom Wheel, so that is obviously amazing. You can get Fear and Terror that way. Also, have a source of escape, which Skrulk doesn't really have. He's kind of stuck if he's on foot. The fact that you actually have armor no matter your form does make you more resistant to Lord sniping, especially by non-AP means. Ikit has some great abilities. Of course, the brass orbs are very powerful as a disruption tool, as well as doing some damage. And the Storm Demon is a very powerful magic missile. Can help snipe enemy lords or beat up on formations, and because it's sort of like an ambush spear. And he does get Lore of Ruin, which, while probably not as powerful as Lore of Plague, is still a very, very potent lore, no doubt about it. I think that's really his main downside compared to Skrulk is really the fact that Lore of Ruin is, in my opinion, a bit inferior to Lore of Plague, but it's still a potent lord. He's still a very strong lord choice. Just that hybrid of combat and caster and tankiness and fear, terror, mount options, and all that stuff is just great. I don't think his abilities are quite as good. I will say, I don't think his abilities are quite as good as Skrulk's, and I don't think his lore is quite as good as Skrulk's, which kind of evens them out a bit in my eyes, but I still think he is easily an S tier. Which leads us to the newest Legendary Lord addition to the Skaven roster, and that is Snitch. Now, the Deathmaster is a solid Lord choice, but I don't think he's an amazing Lord choice. I think he is, in my eyes, somewhere between a B and C. Really, the Skaven roster is just so dominated. I'm going to give him a B, and it's because I think he is a little bit better than Queek. But the Skaven roster is just so dominated by Skrulk and Ikit, and then to a lesser extent other casters. You know what? I'm actually going to put him at C, but what we're going to do here, we're going to put him in front of Queek. I think he is a bit better than him, but I think he's a high C, where Queek's like a low C. So Deathmaster Snitch. And the reason I'm doing this is because I think the Grey Seer is actually a B tier, but he's just better than the Deathmaster. Maybe. It's tough. I'll give him a B. Yeah, but Snitch, what does he have going for him? He's got a snare. He's got AoE debuff. He can actually get some AoE damage to clear out chaff. He does have concealment bombs, so he can kind of sneak around. He can do insane bursts of damage to enemy characters. Especially when they're lower on HP, you can just melt them very, very fast. There was actually some recent games I had on stream where this guy just melted Leonker, for example, very, very fast. And that is really where he shines. The problem is that he is still a foot character. He still can get punted around very easily. He still has very low HP. He's very snipeable. If your opponent catches him and like fireballs him to death, you're screwed. You're in a very, very big trouble. And unlike, he just doesn't have quite the utility of caster lords. Now, he is still a cheap lord option. He still has Vanguard and all these things, but he's not on par with someone like Ikit or Skrulk for the utility he brings. Now, that does bring us on to the generic lord options. Now, for generic lords, Skaven generic lords are not quite as good as some of the legendaries, but I think in some cases they are better than some of the other legendaries. So we're actually going to kick things off with the cheapest of the bunch, which is the Warlord. And I think the Warlord is a C tier. I don't think he's quite up to... I do think he's better than Tretch. If you're going for a dirt cheap survivable lord option, the Warlord is really the way to go. Like, you can't... This guy, if you don't bring anything on him, costs like 650 gold. He's basically 2 units of Clan Rats, so he's incredibly cheap. He's cheaper than a unit of Plague Monks. So you can get an insanely cheap lord. And he does have... His items aren't great, but they can have some effects. Minus 5, I believe, melee attack with Glittering Scales. I think it's the Glittering Scales that he gets. And I know he has a minus to melee attack, but I forget what the item name is. You can put him on a Bonebreaker, the Giant Rat Ogre, which is not terrible, actually. In some cases, it can be decent. You can have a pretty cheap Monstrous Lord, which, you know, it can be cool. It can help you counter. If your opponent goes like with some heavy flyers, you can actually kind of stay on top of them and beat them down a little bit. But I definitely wouldn't consider him great. I just think that he's sort of comparably niche to Queek. Like, there are a handful of matchups and a handful of sort of situations where you just want to go super wide or something where he can work in your favor. Now, moving on to the other Lord that we had right off the bat, and that is, of course, the Grey Seer. And the Grey Seer I actually think is an A tier. For me, it was like you guys saw, it was a little bit of a toss-up for me between B and A. I'm going to give him an A because I actually think the Grey Seer is very strong. And the Grey Seer actually brings some unique stuff compared to both Skrulk and Ikit. That actually makes him a very solid choice. Even if he's not quite up to snuff with them, I think Skrulk's raw damage output and Ikit's sort of heavy-hitting tankiness, or heavy-hitting combat tankiness, I think that does make them better than the Greyseer. But the Greyseer is still very strong because you get a choice of great Lords of Magic. You either go with Lord of Plague or Ruin, both very strong. But you can put him on a Screaming Bell, which is actually a pretty strong ability for Skaven. It can give you a global leadership boost, which can really keep your troops in the fight. It can boost your troops' melee attack, make your troops fight that much better in close quarters. He also has some great items, such as I believe it's the Warp Storm Scroll, which slows enemy flyers as well as damaging them. So it's a great sort of control ability versus flyers. And he does get Arcane Conduit, so you can get a lot of Winds of Magic. You do get a Bound Scorch if you're on the Screaming Bell. So I think this guy is in fact an A tier. He's not he's not quite up to snuff with just, like I said, the raw damage of Skrulk or the tanky damage dealer that is Ikit. But he has this niche. He counters flyers rather well. He is pretty darn tanky when he's thrown on his on the Screaming Bell. He actually has some magic resist on the Screaming Bell, which makes him harder to snipe, on top of his improved armor. So he's stuff like Fireball or Spirit Leech, which is traditionally like a nightmare for Skrulk or something. A Greyseer can shrug it off pretty well if he's on a Screaming Bell. So I think it's an easy A tier for this guy. You're certainly free to disagree. I know that he's slow, and obviously that's one of the big problems. He is slow. He doesn't hold up too well in melee, even on a Bell, because he just can't really escape. He's kind of stuck there, and he's not really built to fight enemy lords or big monsters. But I do think he's a worthy of an A, especially if used correctly. And he is fairly cheap at that, which is another benefit. And the global leadership buff is just not matched by anything in the Skaven roster. Which does move us on to the Warlock Engineer Lord. And this guy is honestly a B or C tier for me. So the reason for why this guy is not getting high up is because he's like a crappy Ikit. And basically, if you're going to bring... This guy's just a bad Ikit. And while Ikit is very strong, there's very little, if any, reason to bring this guy. I'm actually going to put him at C tier because of that. Because I think he is not bad. He's actually... If Ikit wasn't here, this guy would probably be up to like A tier, maybe even S tier, on his own. Probably not quite S tier. I don't think he's quite up to snuff with Ikit. But the Engineering Lord has... He's got access to Lord Ruin. He's got access to the same mounts as Ikit, but he's just worse. He's just not up to par with Ikit, and he is very comparable to Ikit. It's kind of like the situation of the Blood Dragon Lord versus the Red Duke. Or the Strigoi Ghoul King versus the Strigoi Bloodline Lord, where it's a very similar Lord, and as a result, well, one of the Lords is just better at almost everything, and that is, in this case, Ikit. And as a result, this poor guy, while he is a little cheaper, he is perhaps a little more cost-effective that way, Ikit's just better in general, and that's why this guy's getting C tier. It's not really because he's bad. I think if Ikit was gone, this would be an easy A or S. But that's really the only downside to him, is that he's just a worse Ikit. And the way it adds up, in my opinion, when it comes down to cost, for that extra couple hundred gold you might pay for Ikit, it's worth getting those improvements, especially getting access to Storm Demon and stuff like that. It's just much more valuable. But that's just my 2 cents there. And it is why this guy, in my mind, only makes a C tier, even though he's not bad, really, stat-wise. And finally, we have the last Lord option, and that is the Master Assassin Lord. And this guy's awkward. I personally haven't used him very much. I'm going to give him a B tier because I do think that he, similar to Snitch, he brings a little bit of unique utility. He can harass. He can sort of disrupt backlines and be a nuisance in his own right. Now, he's certainly very flimsy, much like Snitch, but he does get a ranged attack, so he can do some ship work. And for that, I think he deserves a B. He's not great, but I think he's unique, and he does have a sort of unique niche. And he doesn't necessarily overlap with Snitch, even though the two are both vanguarding lords. I don't think he quite overlaps with Snitch, and for that, I think it's an easy B tier in my mind. I haven't used them very much, so maybe it's simply inexperience, and I haven't seen the major downsides. Well, there are major downsides, of course. Both of these guys have very low HP, So if your opponent has magic damage to bypass the physical resist, they melt very, very easily. But so I don't want to say I don't see there's disadvantages to him, and obviously neither is a caster and stuff like that. But I haven't seen sort of reasons for why he doesn't bring a unique toolkit to the battlefield. I think he's kind of comparable to Snitch, really, in a lot of ways. But with that ranged attack, he definitely brings a unique flavor that Skaven don't really get otherwise. It gets a ranged character technically, but he can't really kite and sort of poke away the same way the Master Assassin can. It gets more of a static defensive lord if you bring him on foot. Whereas the Assassin Lord can be used very aggressively on foot, as can Snitch for that matter. Now moving on to heroes. Now this is a bit that's expanded as of late. We did of course get the Eshin Sorcerer. But Assassin, actually a very solid hero. I'm actually going to give him an A tier. I personally don't use the Assassin very much, to be quite blunt. But he's a very strong hero, and I think it's indisputable that he can have a massive impact on the battlefield. You get access to trophy heads, debuff enemy lords, melee attack and defense, make them much more vulnerable to snipe out. You do have the concealment bomb, so it's easier to sneak around. You do have, perhaps most importantly, the Rival High Talisman, which is a minus 40 now. It used to be minus 44, but now it's minus 40 melee attack debuff in an AoE around it. And it's one use only, but it can be a massive game changer when it comes to protecting a backline, or protecting your troops, or protecting a segment of front line from collapsing quickly. Minus 40 melee attack is a game changer. And that is what this guy brings to the table. And so I think, and he's cheap-ish, very mobile. He has actually 60 speed, which is pretty nuts. And skittering all along on all fours. He's kind of like a banshee. So even though he's a foot lord, he's not inflexible. And he can actually hit fairly hard if he gets on top of the target, despite not being AP. He's definitely not a sort of pushover. Now, next up we do have the, and actually, you know what? The hero selection, now that I think about it, is really strong for Skaven. Now the Plague Monk, I think I'm going to give him a, it's tough. I think I'm going to give him a B, I'll give him an A tier. I think I'll give him an A tier. So, my reasoning here, the Plague Priest competes a little bit with Skrulk, because Skrulk is such a popular pick and he brings the same lord to the table. I think it restricts this guy a little bit. But you do get the Plague Furnace, which of course is a Mortis engine effect, which is insane. In certain matchups, that could win you an entire game almost. He gets access to the lore of Plague, which obviously gives you great summons, gives you great spells. The lore of Plague is just amazing, except maybe the Plague spell, which I'm not the biggest fan of. But honestly, I've seen it used, put to good use, even recently in some replays that have been sent. It's pretty, yeah, Lord Plague is just strong. He's not a terrible combatant, and he does have an option of an incredibly powerful mount in the form of the Plague Furnace, so really there's not much to say that's bad about this guy. The only reason he's not S tier is because he competes with Skrulk, and Skrulk is really the king of Skaven Lord options, alongside Ikit. So, if like 40% of your games is Skaven, you're picking Skrulk, that's just a sort of theoretical number, but let's say in 40% of your Skaven games you pick Skrulk. And those 40%, you're not really bringing a Plague Priest, or likely not bringing a Plague Priest. And I think that kind of hamstrings this character. And because he's not cheap in the same way that a Warlock Engineer is, and we're going to get that in just a second, I don't think he's quite sort of a top tier pick, even though he's a very potent pick. Now, the Warlock Engineer, I'm actually going to give him an S tier, because I think he's such a powerful hero for how cheap he is, that he deserves an S tier. Lore of Ruin, not actually that strong of a lore, as we just mentioned with Ikit, but it's still a solid lore. None of the Skaven lores are bad by any stretch of the imagination. What this guy does get, though, is Warpstone Armor. This has been nerfed repeatedly, but it is still a dirt cheap, even if weak, but it is a Mortis engine effect that you can get on a dirt cheap character, who is, while certainly snipeable, is not sort of an instant kill. It's not like you're just going to get rid of him instantly. It's still not easy. He still gets punted around because he's on foot. And I think for that reason alone, he actually gets an S tier, because he's just a dirt cheap Mortis engine effect with a decent lore slap to him. And even if you bring Ikit, for example, or sorry, not Ikit, Skrulk, or even Ikit really, just the fact that you can get an additional Warp Storm to lock enemy flyers down is really nice. the fact that you can get that Mortis Engine effect is really nice. I really hate the Mortis Engine effect. I'm such a cheap character that makes him S tier in my mind. Because while yes, the Plague Furnace is insanely good, it costs a lot, and it's not cheap. It is more powerful. Don't get me wrong. It is more powerful than the Mortis Engine effect than the Engineer, but and it's obviously tankier mount and all that, but it's not that dirt cheap. And while applying this constant sort of threat to your opponent. And finally, we do have the Eshin Sorcerer. Now, the Eshin Sorcerer is actually pretty good in my opinion, but I don't think he's as good as the other heroes here. I'm going to give him a B tier. Lore of Stealth is a solid lore, no doubt about it. The passive is really good. It's basically poison, but not, so I believe it stacks with poison. Brittle Bones is very strong as a debuff to enemy units. The missile resist you can get, the armor buffs you can get from it, as well as some of the disruption are all very strong. And of course, Skitter Leap is part of the spell or lore, so there are some very great shenanigans you can pull off, but ultimately it is not up to snuff, I think, with Lore of Plague or Lore of Ruin. It just doesn't have those powerful, like really powerful spells or decisive spells like Warp Storm or Summon Spam that those other lores bring to the table. And the Eshin Sorcerer doesn't really... he's not a great combatant, and he doesn't come in with like a crazy good mount or anything. So he doesn't come in with a mount at all. But he can Vanguard deploy, which is kind of cool. Makes him synergize nicely with Vanguard builds. But Vanguard builds aren't necessarily that much like you can do it as Skaven, but it's not a super strong option. It's a workable option, but not like the best option or anything. So for that reason, I think this guy deserves a B tier. Still a strong caster option. Still definitely a solid. You can pick him as sort of a support character or even as a primary caster, he's perfectly serviceable, but I just don't think he's up to snuff with the other two here, or a lot of the lore choices. The fact of the matter is, you look at the A and S tier here for Skaven, and you're looking at 5 casters right now. Simple fact is this guy's just not quite as good as those other casters. And yeah, there's just a lot of caster options that are very strong for Skaven. Which does move us on to infantry. Now, we're actually going to clump some of these together, basically, because there's a lot of infantry, but a lot of it just overlaps very heavily. So, Skaven Slaves and Skaven Slave Spears. That's really the first category. And they're almost interchangeable in the sense that, depending on matchup, you might want the anti-large, you might not. Depending on how much money you have. In some cases, you might find yourself in a situation where you can squeeze out like 1 extra Skaven Slave that costs 25 less. If 1 extra Skaven Slave, you cut out the spears. Because it's just a unit there to soak up charges. It's like you don't really care too much about the stats a lot of the time. So what I'm going to do with this unit though is very strong. Both of them are. I'm going to give them both an A tier. They're basically interchangeable. I'm actually tempted to give them an S tier. You know what? I'm actually going to give them an S because genuinely Skaven Slaves are a staple of practically every Skaven build. Even Clanrat and Stormvermin and Plague Monk heavy builds will bring a decent lineup of Skaven Slaves to absorb charges, give you additional width, sort of pad out your army, protect your backline, that sort of thing. The two units are practically interchangeable, but oftentimes you'll see them mix and match and whatnot. Skaven Slaves do not actually trade that badly into a lot of units, simply because they have the benefit of strength in numbers, just like all other Skaven troops. So their leadership and melee defense is actually decent initially, and they hold up surprisingly well. Better than, say, Bretonnian peasants, for example. They're also quick on their feet for an infantry unit, so if you manage to breach an enemy backline and rout some of their enemy troops, you can actually chase them off pretty efficiently with Skaven Slaves, where honestly, something like Bretonnian peasants will have probably routed too soon to get into that situation, plus they're not as fast, and obviously zombies are far too slow to be pursuing anything. So they are the only chaff infantry, in my opinion, that's actually decent at pursuing units off the field. And it's very nice for Skaven. Having a 125, 150 gold unit that can chase an enemy troop off the field is wonderful. So easy S tier in my book. I just don't see them as anything less. I think there is not actually a single unit in this roster that you are going to see as often as you're going to see these guys. Simple facts there. Now, moving on to Clan Rats, and this is a bit of a mixed bag. I don't think any clan rat is really that popular, but they're not a terrible unit option. A lot of clan rat viability really, or which clan rats you might use if you are doing clan rat builds. So clan rat builds right now, really the meta for Skaven tends to be, if you're not doing something crazy like a Vanguard build, is these campy. Well, if you're doing a full-on assault build, chances are you're going very heavy into Plague Monks and Stormvermin, maybe backed up by or otherwise you're going Monster and Chariot heavy. But you're not really relying on masses of clan rats. You are extending your width most likely through the use of Skaven Slaves. And so clan rats are not really used that often in any build except sort of static defensive builds, or maybe if you happen to have a little bit of extra cash and you want to extend your line a little bit. Now there were actually, I had some replays submitted recently where people use these very successfully though, so you certainly can make them work. I just don't think they're as popular. What would you give these guys an... kind of debating how exactly I want to divide this, because honestly I think all these units have some merit, but at the same time they're not sort of a top tier unit. I'm going to give them a C tier, I think, and I'm going to give all of them a C tier together because they're very situational. Clan rats, which clan rat you want to pick is going to defend very heavily in matchup, what faction you're facing off against, how heavy they are on missile play, how heavy they are on cav or large play, what your funds are exactly. Once again, that 25, 50 gold difference, whatever, makes a difference. In many ways, they're just shoot up Skaven Slaves, but because you can get like 2 to 3 times the area coverage with Skaven Slaves that you can get with clan rats are just not as popular. It's really the clan rat summons that are popular. That said, if you want a slightly sturdier line, if you want a slightly better combat line, one that can actually trade okay with certain lower end chaff as well, like honestly against a lot of spear units and a lot of cheap like Marauders and stuff, units like that, clan rats will trade fine, honestly, especially clan rats with shields. But even vanilla clan rats and clan rat spears will do okay against a lot of those units, given how cheap they are. So I think C tier is fair. They get the charge defense against large, which actually Skaven Slave spears do not. They are anti-large, but they don't get a charge defense against large. So clan rat spears can provide that charge defense. If you are going against, say, Bretonia, I think they're not a bad choice. Certainly Skaven Slaves can be an additional sort of fodder, but they're not a terrible choice by any means. But I still think that they're just so niche that C tier is really where it's all at, because normally you're going to invest very heavily into monsters, elite infantry, artillery, shooting, whatever, and this mid-tier setup of infantry is just falls by the wayside. Now, from there, we do move on to... if I can find them. Well, it's actually, we do have Warp Grinders, which I almost forgot. I consider them weapons, I always forget that they're actually an infantry. But Warp Grinders are actually very good. I'm going to give them... It's a little hard to say because they just they didn't just release, but they haven't been out for that long. But I think an A tier is perfectly fair for these guys. It's a respectable tier for them. B. I think I'll give him an A. AoE crowd control for a faction that's usually boxing up, so chances are you can predict where your opponent's fast troops are going to go and snare them. Stacked on top of an AoE damage ability makes them pretty respectable for a unit that only costs 600 gold. Definitely solid. Obviously not winning any beauty contests in sustained combat, but all in all, very respectable unit. Easy A tier in my opinion. It's very cost effective at 600 gold. I think there are not many builds where you can't benefit from bringing like one of these guys, just as a sort of disruptive and control tool. Certainly not mandatory by any stretch of the imagination, but maybe I'll give them a B. I don't think they're, but they do have some great utility. They are actually solid in Vanguard builds as well, which is a bit of an interesting niche. And I think there are not many builds where they can't be a useful contribution, even if they are maybe a little niche. I still think they are very respectable. Yeah, I'll give them an A because I think that they just work with a lot of builds, even if they're not sort of a peak choice in every single build. They can work with just about any build. Now, from there we do have Ashen Triads and Plague Monks. I believe both cost 750. That is a bit of a... Well, I'll start with Plague Monks. Plague Monks, a very respectable unit in my opinion, but nowhere near mandatory. I'm going to give him a B tier. I think Plague Monks have a specific... So, Plague Monks have really, I would say, two purposes. One, if you're playing against a faction whose backline harass is not large, is it hounds or bats or maybe carrion, though really against Tomb Guards, you're likely going to see a lot of large. Isn't ideal. Though, actually, these guys traded well into Tomb Guards, so it's actually not all bad. But if you're playing against a faction that has this non-AP backline, or it's not, sorry, non-large backline harass, these guys are very good backline defense in actually as an alternative to Stormmen Halberds or Spears, because they will clean those units up very quickly, and then they can commit to the frontline fight. And second of all, Plague Monks are very good against squishy factions. If you're doing a mad rush, whether it's against squishy factions or against tanky factions with lots of armor, Plague Monks can be a great unit in those situations. Now, if you're dealing with lots of armor, they do require that you build for it. You need to prep. You need to bring Death Runners for Weeping Blade, or maybe nowadays you can bring Snitch for Weeping Blade, or you bring the Regiment of Renown Doomflayers, the Dwarfing Menace for the armor sundering effect. Perhaps you bring a Wither with Lore of Plague, whether on Skrulk or on a Plague Priest, to once again apply that armor sundering effect. Queek for the armor sundering effect. There's just a whole slew of different armor breaking options, and depending on the matchup, whether you're fighting against Dwarves or Chaos or whatever, you're probably going to bring some combination of those, and those situations Plague Monks can shine. That said, Skaven Rush builds are not necessarily the most popular thing ever. And oftentimes, even if you are doing a Skaven Rush build, you might bring an alternative front line, maybe focus more on Stormmen, maybe bring the big brothers of Plague Monks, which are Plague Monks Sensor Bearers, of course. Maybe... Well, there's just so many options for Skaven, for rushes. You can obviously go War Machine and Monster Heavy with Rat Ogres and Hell Pits and all that stuff, so... There's just a lot of options for them. And it was because of that Plague Monks landed at B tier, despite being a very respectable anti-infantry meat grinder. Now, the Triads are, in my opinion, not a very good unit. I'm actually going to give them a D tier. Should I give them a C? Now I'm going to give them a D, because honestly, Skaven Vanguard builds are a little bit of... no, actually, you know what? It's going to land them a C. So, Skaven Vanguard builds are a little bit of a meme, but the fact that you can Vanguard a charge defense against large, concealment bomb equipped, halberd infantry with AP is not terrible for those Vanguard builds. It means you can sort of spring some nasty surprises against an unwitting opponent. And with Weeping Blade, they actually synergize rather well with the non-AP Skaven skirmish forces. That is really these guys' main niche. In actual combat, they're a pretty terrible unit. Very low HP pool, disastrously low model count at 54, which is worse than everything except Depth Guard with pole arms, and we all know Depth Guard with pole arms are trash, so that's not something you want to be compared to. They are pretty mobile, which makes them a little better at flexing counter enemy large, but still. You don't actually want the only matchup or the only situation where I think these guys are actually good is in a Vanguard build, where you can use them in these sort of ambushing roles. But I think as a whole, the unit in the majority of Skaven matchups, this unit is not worthwhile and not really worth attempting at bringing. But weirdly enough, because they are so strong in those ambush situations, I'm going to give them a C tier. So I do think that is a bit of a... Well, no, I'll give them a C. They also have that fairly high physical resist, so it helps too. Actually, no, we are going to give them a D, because I think extra strides will deserve a C, even though they're not that great of a unit either. Which, with Plague Monks and all that out of the way, we do now have Death Runners, if I can find them. Death Runners, here we go. Now, I personally adore Death Runners. I'm going to give them a B tier. If you're going to run well, almost they should give an A, really. They're a very good unit. You get Vanguard, Concealment Bombs. You can shut down enemy backlines with these guys. You can support a non-AP frontline with these guys. You can honestly use them as an independent AP unit against infantry, because these guys do have a bonus for infantry nowadays. Their big downside is, of course, they're very squishy. 54 models, just like the Ixchis Triads. Incredibly flimsy. Especially if your opponent has magic damage, these guys die like flies. But as this stellar support tool for units like Plague Monks, Stormmen, as this backline harass, they are very, very strong. In a defensive formation, I don't think they're worthwhile, and I think Skaven have so many Skaven builds are very defensive in nature or very campy in nature. I think that holds these guys back a bit. But nonetheless, I think there are very few Skaven. And I would say if you're running a mass AP build, if it's an offensive build that's built around chariots or built around rat ogres, stuff like that, these guys really don't have a place there. But except maybe as backline harass. So I don't think they're king in every matchup, but I think they do have some great potential. And that's why they're going to net a B tier for themselves. Now moving on to Stormermen. We're going to start with the Stormermen Halberds, actually. They're cheaper, so used to Halberds being more expensive. But Stormermen Halberds, I'm going to give them B tier again. I think they're, in my book, they'd almost land a C tier, really. But I'm going to give them a B. The reason being is if you're going to bring one or two, well, no, I'll give it a B. So if you're going to bring one or two elite, quote-unquote elite, it's Skaven standards, but if you're going to bring some more competitive, no, I'm going to put it in a C. If you're going to bring some more competitive anti-large, you're going to bring these guys. They're not great anti-large tool, but they do have enough models and mass to where they can slow enemy monsters down. If you camp them on top of something like a Warplane Cannon, they can definitely resist enemy incursions. One of the big downsides for them, quote-unquote downsides for them, it's not really their fault, but the fact that the Council Guard is just so strong right now means that usually if you're going to bring one unit of Stormmen Halberds, it's going to be Council Guard. Whereas previously you would have probably just brought unit Stormmen, and then maybe like a Skaven Slave or two. So that has kind of changed the situation with these guys, but they still deserve, in my opinion, an easy C tier. Because they do still have it's kind of like Clan Rats. They're not a terrible unit in and of themselves, but the Skaven meta doesn't really allow them to shine as much. Usually if you're playing offensive, you're going to counteract enemy large through different means. If you're playing defensive, you're countering large through, once again, different means. And the ground troops are just there to zone your opponent away while you shoot them to death or beat them to death with monsters. So you don't necessarily want to invest too much in it. But still, Stormmen very powerful in their own right. They've come a long way. They used to be a pretty terrible halberd unit, like literally the worst halberd unit in the game for the price. And they've evolved from that. And I think they are in a much better spot than they used to be. Now, Sword and Board Vermin are, in my opinion, actually a really good unit. I'm going to put them at B, because I think that, once again, it's this lineup of, you have so many rush options, but I think they are a stellar unit. Solid in holding, solid in an aggressive stance if you need to push through your opponent's lines. These guys, while their stats on paper don't look great, it looks like you're basically paying for a unit of Chaos Warriors, except 300 gold more expensive. The fact that they have 120 models means that they mulch all other infantry in like the 700 to 800 gold price range. Chaos Warriors, for example, get demolished. These guys lose like 50% of their HP and destroy Chaos Warriors. They're a very, very strong unit. With benefits from armor sundering effects, it's even more disgusting. You combine them with Sweeping Blade, you combine them with Wither, with armor sundering, whatever. They're a monster. And Skaven are just so good at armor sundering that it really allows Stormmen to shine. And yeah, I actually like them in the Dwarf matchup, for example. They're very sturdy, very solid unit option. So easy B for me. I'm not going to spend too much time explaining, but I just think that's a good reason to put them there. And finally, the Censer Bearers. These guys at one point would have been probably a D or even F tier for me. I thought they were pretty terrible. Nowadays, I think that once again they found a little bit of a niche as a rushing unit. I'm struggling between B and C tier. I think I'm going to give them B, actually, which surprises me. But I've been playing them a lot. Contaminate is not a terrible effect. You can combo with Ikit's lore passive to get some crazy terror routes very quickly. They've been cheapened, and they hit rather hard for their cost. You can also buff them with Skaven Lord Ruin, especially Death Frenzy, make them hit that much harder, or that much more consistently, and it really makes them a very, very solid unit. Where previously I really wouldn't have rated these guys very highly. Like I said, probably D or F tier. But I think right now, if you're doing a rush build with Skaven, these guys are a great choice. But once again, they are competing with a lot of other unit options, and for that reason, they're not going to make the cut any higher. I'm definitely not putting them at A or S tier. I'm leaning more towards C with these guys, but I think like a low B, high C is where they belong. You know what, maybe I will put them at C tier. I'll put them at C, but they are a very respectable unit. And I really would say, guys, if the unit's out of F tier, it's at least usable or viable. And if it's like C or higher, it's a consistently decent choice, in my opinion. Or somewhat, mostly consistently. Good choice. We're decent at least. Passable. Now, that does bring us on to Regiments for now. And here, well, Skaven have some very powerful choices. If I can find them. Which is a challenge in and of itself. Now, Clan Vulcan's Tail Slashers, I think, very respectable unit. I'm going to give them a B tier. They're not great, but they are a budget sort of anti-infantry option. They're clan rats that are a bit, well, they're veteran C9, and they hit a bit harder. They've got fire resist, which is kind of a joke, but hey, it means they don't get roasted by burning head as easily, I guess. Maybe that's the intention, actually. Maybe that's even the intent there. But they're not a bad unit by any stretch of the imagination. They can really maul lower-end cheap infantry. And for that reason, I think they deserve a B. They're a decent choice in any rush army, and a decent choice as a sort of additional anger. It's kind of the way Königstein Stalkers are budget Graveguard. These guys are a budget Stormwind, essentially. So that's why they net themselves a B tier. There's a lot of Skaven rush builds where I like to throw these guys in just because they give you a little bit of extra oomph if you're stuck on just that last couple hundred gold and you don't have money to get a better unit like Plague Monks or Stormwind in there. Which brings us on. I forget how some of these guys stack up price wise. I'm trying to keep everything go everything at price here, and so Ixchis Triads. These guys are decent. I'll give them that. They're not great, but they are decent. I think that these guys actually deserve a B tier. I'll give them a B. So they're basically triads that get a non-damage dealing copy of themselves they can summon. Now this copy is always at 120 models, even if you've got, or sorry, not 120. Wow, blank in here. At 54 models. So even if this unit is like mauled and down to one model, and you summon their clone, it's not fooling anybody. They know it's a summon, but it's a physical unit. It's still blocking your opponent. It's still messing with them, making it harder for them to interrupt your backline. And I think it's a passable anti-large unit. You get concealment bombs so you can sneak around and potentially return to a fight after it's gone south. And yeah, the summon can help protect the backline. Helps compensate for their relatively high cost. I think they are a respectable anti-large choice, if not an amazing one. Still, I think they're respectable in more builds. Certainly not, they're not sort of relegated to niche ambush option like normal triads. That does get us onto the Regiment of Renown Death Runners. Now these guys, I really want to like them because I like Death Runners a lot myself, but I actually think that they don't really bring much to the table over normal Death Runners. They're much tankier. Maybe I'm a B tier for that, because I do think they're good, and they're good in many of the same situations as normal Death Runners are. But ultimately, it's a question of, do you want to pay more for slightly better tankiness and better sustained combat stats, especially with their trait active, which improves their, I believe it's melee defense and physical resist. Off the top of my head, makes them tankier. But at the same time, they do cost a lot more than vanilla Death Runners, so it's a trade-off. And where the unit should fall, I think is a bit debatable. And in some ways, I feel it should almost be lower than normal Death Runners, because if you just want the utility, you'll probably just bring the cheap Death Runners instead of an expensive variant. I actually think I will put this guy at C tier, because I just think that in most cases, you're just going to get normal Death Runners. And even though these guys are pretty darn strong, if you want utility, you'll bring normal Death Runners. Generic backline harass, Death Runners are good enough. Certainly, they're not as good as these guys, but the Regiment around Death Runners, just not holding up as well, in my opinion. Now, Regiment of Renown Council Guard. These guys are really the creme de la creme. These guys border on S tier in my mind. I'm actually tempted to give them an S tier. So you see these guys a lot. There you will see almost every matchup. There are some where I don't think they're worth it, like Dwarves. Or maybe like Vampire Coast. So I will put them at A tier. They are a very strong option. They're very much upper A, lower S. there are very few builds where you will not benefit. Much like with Warp Grinders, there are very few builds where you cannot put in Council Guard and get benefits from it. They're a very simplistic unit. They're rank 9 Stormmen with Unbreakable and Guardian. But that combination of traits is amazing for Skaven. Screw it, give me a S tier. Make your lords tankier, make them harder to snipe out. Great. Unbreakable unit for a faction that likes to rout at the drop of the hat. Easy S tier. Their combat stats are not the best, but still, they're very, very respectable. It's kind of funny that a C tier unit has an S tier Regiment of Renown, but the way the perks on this unit come into play, in my opinion, makes it easy S tier. And then we do have the Blight Scouts Plague Pack, and I'm going to give these guys a B tier. I think that if you're going to go with a massive rush of Plague Monk Sensor Bearers, you're going to bring these guys probably. You can throw them in. But they do have an additional niche or additional supporting tool because they do have Demagoguery, I believe it's called, which grants all nearby units immunity to psychology. I apologize. I don't remember all the. I don't have them like written down in front of me, and I don't remember every ability name by heart. I just know what the abilities do. So Demagoguery grants nearby units immunity to psychology, which of course is great for Skaven. Like we just discussed, that's the thing that makes Council Guard great is Unbreakable, and a faction that likes to rout. Well, these guys give immunity to psychology, and as some of you guys might have seen, for example, some of my games against Indie Pride and stuff, I like to bring these guys in Death Ball builds where they just provide that aura of immunity to psychology, and for most Skaven units, that's a valuable trait. Because the only units that are actually immune to terror or death are the Pulpit Abominations and Doom Wheels. Everything else is at least susceptible to terror. The majority of the Skaven roster is susceptible to fear, and of course chain routing. Because if you're immune to psychology, you don't actually take a penalty for nearby units fleeing. So it makes these guys really good. And being a rank 9 Sensor Bearer, these guys are nearly unbreakable. They're a functionally unbreakable unit, especially in Death Ball where you can prevent them from getting dragged out and isolated. They're about as breakable as Blackguard and Aggron. Now, that does get us on to the missile play, which is really where Skaven shine and really sort of have built their reputation recently. Starting off with Skaven Slaves Slingers, a very respectable unit for how cheap they are. 200 gold missile unit that granted does almost no damage per shot, but it's like having a dirt cheap Goblin Archers essentially. Easy B tier. Not great in every matchup. They obviously you can't just throw. They're not a unit you want to use as a roadblock the way you want normal Skaven Slaves. But if you just want some cheap chip damage, especially against low armor factions like Beastmen or Norska or honestly, given that Skaven had access to so much armor sundering effects too, even against higher armor factions, but against like Vampire Coast or stuff like that, there's just a lot of situations where you can make great use of Skaven Slave Slingers to just whittle your opponent down. And even against Empire and stuff, they're a cheap unit. 200 gold for a ranged unit, like you can't complain about that. They're great. Now, with that, we do move on to runners and Nightrunners first and foremost. These guys, bit of a mixed bag in my opinion. I think vanilla Nightrunners are a B tier. I think that unfortunately it's hard to tell here, but the ones that are marked green are the poison variants of Shadowrunners and Nightrunners. I had to mark them green because I couldn't get access to the poison variant unit portraits, but the Nightrunner Slingers, I like them. I'm pretty fond of the unit myself. I used to use them for some cheesy builds, but I think C tier, leaning towards even D tier, is probably more appropriate. The simple fact is Skaven nowadays have so many insane range damage options that the chip damage from Pebble play has really fallen off. Now, Nightrunner vanilla variant, you can throw them into melee and they're okay, and they can be used to sort of kite opponents, throw shurikens at them, and whittle them down over time. So I think they do net themselves a B tier. Certainly not as great as their Gutter Runner comrades, but very, very solid. But the vanilla Slingers, unfortunately, I think have fallen off quite a bit with the advent of weapons teams and as well as buffs to other weapons teams that used to be not very competitive. The Poison Wind Globes have come a long way. Death Globes have come some way. Obviously, the Warp Fire Throwers have come a very long way. And we got Rattling Guns now and Giselles, and in the light of that, Nightrunners have fallen off. Though I still think they do have some competitive value. If you're doing a Mass Vanguard build, they can do great. If you've got Armor Sundering effects on the field, they can do great. And against lightly armored factions, they can do insane amounts of work to mass them. Now, going into... We're not going to go by cost here, because I feel like sort of doing a group of units here. Next up, we're going to do the runners. I'm actually going to give Gutter Runners, the vanilla variant, a C tier, as well as Gutter Runner Slingers a C tier. The reason for that is because if you're going for just a handful of a very light harass build, I think you're better off bringing Gutter Runner with poison, because they're only slightly more expensive and they are much better at escaping thanks to poison. They can kite much more effectively. And if you're looking to do a sort of heavy harass build, you're probably going to combo poison Gutter Runners with Nightrunners, because Nightrunners are much cheaper. Now, these guys do have the benefit of having stock compared to Nightrunners, which can certainly be an advantage. But I think that in general, the way most Skaven Kite builds play, you're probably going to... These guys are a slightly lower priority than Nightrunners or Gunrunner with poison. Now, the Gutter Runner Slingers, well, they're just Gutter Runner Slingers. It's much like Nightrunners. They're not a terrible unit, but because they don't have AP, they're just a much harder unit to make work in most situations than the armor-piercing weapons teams Skaven have access to. And for that reason, they do net themselves a C tier. I still think they're great to counteract enemy range play, because Skaven don't always have the best tools to counter enemy missile play, even to date. Rattling Guns or Giselles, even Mortars are not always the best units against enemy archer play and stuff like that. So it can be very beneficial, but I think no more than C tier is fair. Now for poison for Slingers with poison, I think it's actually going to be D tier. The way Skaven play out, so usually you want the poison in a more defensive function, and for that, Gutrunners with poison are just much better. I'm going to give Gutrunners with poison an A tier, because between nets as well as poison, they can act as a great sort of midline defense unit that can protect your backline a little bit. They're also not terrible in combat, so they can actually slow your opponent down in melee. And if you're looking to do a Vanguard play and harass that way, they're a very strong unit, once again, because poison plus nets plus their high speed just allows them to kite away, and they can combo really nicely with Nightrunners. They can combo really nicely with Gutter Runners. Both of those units can kite, while these guys sort of provide that sort of slowing power. The only reason I think these guys do not actually go straight to, are not outright terrible, I think, is because if you're doing a mass pebble build, and these are nowadays very difficult to justify, but if you're trying to do a mass pebble build, these guys are a nice supplement. They can provide you with, they can debuff enemy archers and prevent them from countering you as effectively. That's why I'm putting Gutter Runners with poison at D tier rather than a full-on F or something. But I certainly don't think they're a great unit for the cost in most situations. But I personally do enjoy running the occasional pebble build, so I will give them a D tier for that. But I don't think they're amazing. Now going on to Globadiers before we clear through weapons teams, because that's a massive chunk of units there. So Poison Wind Globes have come a long way. They're a much better unit. I would actually rate them as a B tier. Solid against any high model count large unit. Anything that's Cav or higher in model count, these guys do exceptionally well against, and they do okay against single entities and monstrous troops. Their damage over time is stellar. Their damage output is actually really good for a unit that only costs 550 gold. 100 armor makes them pretty sturdy against both melee and ranged harass. And they are still relatively mobile, being a Skaven unit. Just a great cheap point defense unit. Their friendly fire is a big downside, though, and it is one thing that holds them back, in my opinion, from being a better unit. Otherwise, I think they would definitely be better. Now, Death Globes, much harder to justify. I'm going to give them a D. No, I'll give them a C, because I don't think they're quite D tier. They can delete enemy infantry in seconds, still. I think a lot of people underestimate that fact. But with Poison Wind Globes having been buffed to sort of compete in that role, Poison Wind Globes are not as good as Death Globes in just deleting enemy infantry, but they are close. There's a serious comparison to be made there. With that buff, with the fact these guys are not particularly great against single entities, with the fact that they are much more expensive, they cost which in turn makes it worse to. So if Poison Wind Globes attack cheap trash, you don't care. The unit costs 550 gold, so it's not sort of a massive detriment money-wise. But if Death Globes are wasting their ammo attacking like peasant mobs or Skaven Slaves or zombies, that is a massive detriment. That's not acceptable. You can't be wasting these guys' ammo on miners. Ammo needs to be spent on valuable units. And the fact that fact really restricts this unit, in my opinion. That said, if you need to crush enemy infantry, no matter what race, no matter what HP values or armor or anything, Death Globes will do the job for you. They are definitely very strong. Now, going into weapon scenes, we are starting with the cheapest of the bunch, which is, of course, the glorious Warp Fire Thrower. Unit that, in my mind, is going to get a C tier. I'm sure some people are going to disagree here, and honestly, I'm wavering on C to D tier. Maybe some people think it's better, maybe some people think it's worse. You do get to apply the burnt effect, which is great. You can debuff. It stacks. It's amazing for leadership monks. Combine this with Plague Monks for the Contaminate, or Scroll or Plague Priest or whatever for Contaminate, or Contaminate from Plague Claw Catapult or something like of that nature. And say Lord Ruin passive, you've immediately got minus 20 leadership, stacked on Fear and Terror. You can cause a very quick rout. So that makes them very, very strong. Besides that, their damage output's not terrible. With the buffs made to explosive damage, these guys are much more potent than they used to be. Still very difficult to make use of because of the flat arc. They tend to not get good shots and struggle to find an angle to shoot from. But when they do, they can certainly do a lot of work, and they're all of units, even large single entities, they will melt very efficiently. Now that does bring us on to Rattling Guns. Rattling Guns being a rather powerful unit. I think we're going to give Rattlings a B tier. Suppression plus insane damage per second at short ranges makes them a very potent choice. That said, they are still an expensive unit at 850, and at longer ranges, they really... Many people think that they're just better than Poison Globes, for example, because they have much more range. But that range doesn't matter too much because their dispersion is terrible at max range. These guys will miss like 3/4 of their shots or something, getting no value out of the firepower, really. And so that really holds the unit back, in my mind, because it is a very short-range unit and it costs a lot of money. So that's a hindrance. But still, AP guns that just melt stuff at shorter ranges. They are really a threat to any flyer or big monster or chariot or whatever that's trying to plow through your lines, and easily netting themselves a B2. The big complaint, Jezzails, of course, and they were everyone's most hated nemesis in the last patch. I'm actually going to give them... I'm struggling to decide if they deserve an A or even a downright B. They're not that good of a unit nowadays. Still very strong. I'm going to give them I give them an A out of respect for the fact that they let Skaven win the artillery game still, or give them a very solid chance of winning the artillery game. But they're not that good of a... Their DPS is very low. In my opinion, it's one thing that people grossly underestimate or overestimate is just how much damage these guys actually do. Their DPS is very, very subpar. The precision is stellar, no doubt about it. Their range is rather good at 275. They do have silver shields and 70 armor, so they're not super vulnerable necessarily, but they certainly have their limitations. And I don't think they are anywhere near the threat level they used to be a few patches back. And for that reason, they're going to net themselves a very comfy A tier. I think probably A, leaning towards B even. They're just not that great. And finally, we have Mortars. I almost forgot about them. The new addition, Mortars. Poison Wind Mortars seem to be pretty solid. I personally have not used them very much, but I have seen some players who seem to be getting some value out of them. They can mince through infantry formations pretty well, but they are not cheap. They are a fairly expensive unit. They are also relatively hard to shut down. I'm going to give them a B tier. I think that is fair. As a survivable sort of alternative, where the Plate Clock Catapult has better range and in some ways has better damage. It's much more vulnerable to counter battery, whether magical or actual artillery. But these guys are much more mobile, much more. You can use them in a much more fluid playstyle, and I think because of that, they do deserve B tier. Very niche. They are not going to counteract. They're kind of like Outrider grenade launchers or Empire mortars or whatever. They only really counter infantry. So if you try to put them up against anything else, they fail. But against infantry, they do rather well. They get B tier. Moves us on to Regiments of Renown. First and foremost, the Teethbreakers. A really good unit in my opinion. I'm actually going to give them an A tier here. Right up alongside Jezzails. I think that if you're going to bring a Rattling Gun, you're going to bring the Teethbreakers, really. That's really a reason to put the Rattling Gun down, I think, because these guys are much more precise, and they do have the concealment bombs. So if you find yourself in a bad spot where your opponent's trying to charge you with the unit, you can potentially stealth these guys last second, deny your opponent a charge. There was some great game I think I saw on Turn's channel where he was about to get charged by Skinwolves, pops concealment bomb, Skinwolves lose the attack order, and then Teethbreakers just annihilate Skinwolves in a volley of Warpstone. So they're a very, very strong unit, and basically clear up a lot of the weaknesses for normal Rattling Guns, especially for long range inaccuracy. And Natty Bubos, and I'm sure this is going to be a controversial take, but I'm going to put them at A tier and not S. I don't think they're an S tier. They can dominate the artillery game against dwarves, but they're not a mandatory pick in the dwarf matchup. And to be honest, in some matchups, they're just straight up inferior choice to normal Jezzails. Their entire gimmick is stalk and snipe, but if you're playing against a rush faction, why bother? First of all, you probably don't want Jezzails against a rush faction, but even if you are going to try to risk Jezzails against a rushier or faster faction, these guys are just a terrible choice. They're a waste of money. The only real benefit you get is fast rate of fire, which I don't think is worth it most of the time. So I do think they net themselves an A tier. Good against enemy artillery, but in against factions that are not going to play that static game, they definitely fall off a lot, even compared to normal Jezzails. And finally, the Regiment of Renown Avalanche Mortar. These guys, I'm going to give an F tier to. They appeared to be completely broke OP before the patch dropped, but I have not seen them used well once in the last few weeks. I have not seen them netting some monstrous results, certainly. They got nerfed rather significantly before the patch went live, and this was known, but the unit is very expensive. It costs 1,500 gold for a unit that is very situational, really designed to deal with infantry again, except 1,500 gold now. And that just, in my opinion, is kind of unacceptable. It's just not worth it in any circumstance, really, to bring these guys over normal mortars or any of the other Skaven ranged powerhouses. It's very difficult to justify it. Now, next up, we are going to go into, well, we got a lot of options, but we'll just, because we're on the ranged kick here, we're gonna go into artillery. We're gonna start with the Plate Clock Catapult, a unit that used to be pretty great. Nowadays, I'd say it's less good. I'm gonna put it as C tier. I think it's respectable as a anti-infantry tool. It has some great splash, it has a contaminated effect, it can do a lot of damage to infantry. That said, it is obviously very niche. Once the mortar has, in my opinion, supplanted it in a lot of ways. The mortar just being more flexible and kind of more survivable helps it a lot. And I think the Plate Claw has fallen off a bit. Still a potent artillery piece if you get in the right position. Magic damage actually helps against a lot of factions and a lot of units, since it helps your splash bypass that physical resist, where normally units might lose the model that gets directly hit, but then the surrounding units will shrug it off for the explosive damage with their armor, or with their physical resist. The Plague Claw does not allow that, so that's really nice. But ultimately, just being a very vulnerable artillery piece and a very, in a roster that already has other tools for its purpose, I think it's not really that great. Warplane Cannon, the worst dueling artillery piece in the game. I would give it a D tier, actually. I'm going to give it a D tier because I think that in most cases, if you're going to bring a Warplane Cannon, you're going to bring the Zap Zap Cannon. I'm actually going to give the Zap Zap Cannon, I think, a B tier. So the Warplane Cannon is great against cavalry, like all cannons. It has the fastest rate of fire of any cannon. This is one thing a lot of people don't realize, but it actually fires about 50% faster, 25 to 50% faster than like an Empire grade cannon, which is a huge advantage. It does lose almost all artillery duels. 50-50 is a high elf bolt thrower, which isn't great given that the high elf bolt thrower costs 300 less gold. And that's assuming the bolt thrower starts at max range and has to wander into range. And otherwise, the odds are even worse for the Warplane Cannon. The Warplane Cannon only beats the Carronade, I think, out of all artillery pieces in the game. So maybe the Dark Elf bolt thrower, I'm not sure, maybe the Reaper. But either way, the definitely not great in dueling artillery pieces, which is a huge restricting factor. Very easy to snipe its abilities like Fireball, which really hinders it. Expensive at 1,000 gold. Does delete cavalry, so I think in like the Bretonnia matchup, maybe the Empire matchup, the Warplane Cannon's a decent choice, even with Jezzails on the field nowadays. But definitely not great. That said, Zap Zap Cannon, which resets enemy cooldowns, is a very potent choice, and I think it deserves a B tier. Being able to reset your enemy's cooldowns can be a huge boon. Stack that on top of great precision, great rate of fire, and you've got a very, very potent unit. And I think in a lot of matchups, you can justify bringing a Zap Zap Cannon, where you would not bother with a normal Warplane Cannon. Let's just get us on to monsters, which is a very simple and small category. Rat Ogres, easy A tier, bordering on S really. Rat Ogres you'll find in almost every build. High mass blocker unit, they've got some decent AP performance, so they can beat up on units trying to push through your line or whatever. Pretty mobile, the 60 speed. They got Frenzy. They're not the greatest stat wise, but a very respectable unit for how cheap they are. At 800 gold, they are really. In most Skaven builds, you will see Skaven Slaves and Rat Ogres as backline defense, and they perform very admirably. But if you want to go offensive with Rat Ogres, you can do that as well and use them as a sort of breakthrough monster, and they will certainly do the job okay. And it's kind of a simplistic rundown, but really Rat Ogres aren't bad at anything for how cheap they are. At 800 gold, they can just perform okay in just about anything. They can help counter enemy cav, they can help break enemy lines, they can protect your backline, zone out enemy glores on big flyers, stuff like that. They're just a very respectable all-rounder. Pulpit Abomination, the A-Bomb, C tier. Can beat up on enemy large pretty effectively. Does, I believe, have some bug animations still. I could be wrong. Maybe those were fixed. Not entirely sure. I actually enjoy using the A-Bomb, though. Massive HP pool. Incredibly tanky. The biggest downside is the fact that Too Horrible to Die is random, and it happens at 10% health. So a lot of times your health hit will be at 900 HP, which is actually still a lot, and it will just automatically die, which sucks. It's terrible. You don't want to gamble entire games on that, and that's really the biggest downside to the unit. If Too Horrible to Die was not a thing, I think this unit might actually be a B tier. But if you at actually doing damage, it's a respectable unit. If Too Horrible to Die procs, it is an insane beast. 9,000 HP with regen, with the potential to recover so much of it through self-replenishment, is insane. And it does hit like a truck, 500 weapon strength. Not great combat stats, but those can be compensated for with spells and magicry. 1,800 gold for this unit, so it's not that expensive. And actually not that immobile. I think it has over 50 speed off the top of my head, so it's actually a fairly mobile slug and can really be a beast on the battlefield and a great anchor for a Skaven battle line. And finally, we do have the War Machines, and there's only 2 of them, obviously, so it's a pretty easy one. Doom Flares, easy A tier. Doom Wheel, easy B tier. Doom Flares, I think, are great because they're just so strong at backline harass. Very difficult to shut down because they've got some insane, and I mean insane animations. They have a very small hitbox, which makes missile play against them very difficult. Unless your opponent gets like a perfect snare in the open. They actually have decent sustained combat stats with an additional boost to armor when they're in sustained or when they're in melee, so pretty darn sturdy. And yeah, easy A tier for these guys. There's not really many situations where I think you can't benefit from one or two Doomflayers to run enemies over, and they can kind of block enemy large stuff too, because they do have some high mass and free models, which is passable. And very high weapon strength means that if you screw up and don't micro these guys super well, they can still stay in sustained combat and perform well, despite being a chariot type unit. Now, Doom Wheels, at one point, probably the model of the best sort of single entity chariot, except maybe like the High Elf Noble in the game. So a very powerful chariot unit, but it I think is not as great. If you're looking for just damage output, I don't think it's as good as the Doomflayers nowadays. And I also think that you'll often bring Ikit Claw with the Doom Wheel mount instead. That said, the Doom Wheel is still very potent. Still causes terror, which is really nifty. If you go with a Skrulk build, the fact that you can still bring terror on a very mobile mount with the Doom Wheel is very nice. Has okay combat stats. Can really run enemies over and just be an absolute nightmare to deal with and shut down. So in my opinion, gets an easy B tier. It is, however, much more susceptible to ranged fire than Doomflayers, and I think that is one thing that really holds it back and prevents it from getting up into an A or even S tier on this list. Now, weirdly enough, the regiments renowned for these units are not as good in my opinion. The Dwarfing Menace is going to net a B tier. The reason for that is that when you're talking about chariots, you don't worry too much about sustained combat stats. This unit's primary gimmicks are that it brings fear and that it brings a armor sundering effect. Now, fear is not that hard to come by on this Skaven roster. You've got it on other units. And armor sundering is great if you're comboing with the few units in the Skaven roster that are non-AP. But that is a very niche application. In most situations, I think it's more worthwhile to just bring generic Doomflayers because they are cheaper and do the same job if you're not concerned about helping your units. And so for that reason, these guys are actually going to net a B, where the normal Doomflayers net themselves an A. And then the same thing with the Wheel of Doom. Except it's actually going to be even lower. I think I'm bordering on D tier for this guy. I'm going to give it a C, because I think that the sustained combat stats on Doom Wheel can matter. The unit does occasionally find itself stuck in sustained combat. It is essentially a heroic chariot, and for that reason you will occasionally use it in that sustained combat where stats matter. But its primary perks are not really that great. It shoots double the warplaning shots, which in my experience is not sort of a game-changing perk. And besides that, it just costs 300 more gold. So that's kind of painful and difficult to justify in most cases. And I think in most cases, if you just want a mobile terror causer, you're going to go with generic Doom Wheel. But that is it. That is Skaven. That is the Skaven roster in a nutshell. There are some units that I'm a little iffy on still, mostly because I haven't used them necessarily as much as I would have liked. Especially Skaven Mortars and units like that. But by and large, I think the Skaven roster is a roster of many competitive units. I don't think any unit except maybe the Avalanche Mortar is actually outright terrible. Skaven roster. I think all of them have their place and all of them have their niche where they can perform well. It shows very clearly, I think, with how many B and C tier units there are here, that the Skaven have a good amount of competitiveness across their entire roster. But maybe you guys disagree. Maybe I've just kind of mistiered things here. Maybe I'm just off. And you guys can certainly let me know. Let me know if you agree. Let me know if you think this list is ridiculous and it's way off. Let me know what your thoughts, opinions, where we diverge. As I've mentioned before, I really do enjoy reading your guys' responses and seeing a lot of times I've just learned new ways or figured out new ways from you guys how to use units that I'm not a big fan of. Because everyone has their playstyle, and sometimes because you try to stay with a certain playstyle, you play a certain way. You don't really make the best use of units that don't fit that playstyle. And I'm perfectly open to suggestions or critiques. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Certainly leave me your thoughts and opinions down below, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.